to the cloud. Hi, everyone. So I'm Julian Elliott. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. Thank to Per and the team for inviting me, and also thank you to Stein for helping deal with last-minute technical issues. So I'm just going to present today a little on the experience that we've had with Living Guidelines in Australia. So first of all, just so you know a little bit about me and my potential competing interests. So I'm chair of the Australian Living Evidence Consortium. I was until recently the director of the National COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Task Force, which I'll be talking about a bit more today. A lot of my work is based at Cochrane, Australia, within Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. I'm an infectious disease physician and co-founder and CEO of Covidence, a non-profit platform for systematic review. So this model of clinical practice guideline, I think, should be well known to everyone, where we assemble multidisciplinary teams to create systematic reviews and then feed that into a team that is tasked with developing a clinical practice guideline, of course, with the aim of improving decisions for clinical care at the bedside and ultimately improving healthcare. Now, of course, despite the strengths of this model, it's very time and resource intensive, very difficult both to scale, to sustain, and to keep it up to date with the flow of new research. So we have this trade-off between quality and the currency of the process. And it's this tension between these two that we've been tackling now for several years. So following initial work now some years ago on developing the living systematic review model, we then moved to developing a model of living guidelines. So conceptually, this is distinct from conventional guideline update, where in a conventional update, once you've done all that hard work of climbing the mountain to create a guideline, the guideline is then fixed in time. And then with the flow of new research, the guideline gradually becomes out of date, therefore less accurate, and therefore has less value in our healthcare system, until at some point in time, a decision is made to update again, and then you have to climb the mountain once more, often just as much work as the initial guideline development. In contrast, a living guideline, there is no escaping the initial need to climb the mountain to develop that initial up-to-date guideline, what we call a baseline guideline. But then from that point onwards, we enter these very tight, rapid and frequent cycles of searching for evidence, incorporating that new information into living systematic reviews, feeding that to update our grade evidence profiles, and then, if appropriate, updating our guideline recommendations. And so in this way, we can maintain the guideline in a more up-to-date state over time. So it's not no effort, it is certainly effort, but that effort is more evenly distributed over time. And through that, we can break this trade-off and create guidelines that are both trustworthy and up to date with the latest research. So now about almost 4 years ago, we formed the Australian Living Evidence Consortium to really build on the work that we'd been doing in living systematic reviews and start to tackle what we saw as the next frontier, which was the development and piloting of living guidelines. This is a group of 12 organisations working across 5 chronic disease areas in Australia. And through that group, we initiated a number of pilot projects. The first was the National Stroke Guidelines, which became really the first national grade-based living guidelines anywhere in the world. And stroke continues in this living mode now for over 2 years, and I think has really paved the way, and we've learned so much from this pilot. Over that period of time, there's been a number of updates which have included really important developments in the guidance around elements of stroke care. So these are meaningful updates to the guidelines. They're not just minor tweaks. What we've found through that process also is that it's actually quite feasible to maintain the guideline in that living state, walking across the plateau. So for example, here you can see in these data over about an 8-month period that the median time to screen our titles and abstracts was about 16 hours per month. So certainly quite feasible. Also done some research on how these guidelines are received by end users. And so you can see here, there was a perception of increase in likelihood to follow, frequency of access, likelihood of access, and importantly in trust. And then that translated through to the actual use of the guideline. So you can see here in this period where we were in conventional updating mode of updating once every several years, there was a fairly kind of constant level of access of the web-based guidelines. But once we started to update more frequently, these are both major and minor updates, the amount of use of the guideline measured through access through the website was more than 3 times as high. So quite good, at least process data, that the guideline is being much more widely used than the previous model. Following the stroke pilot, we then moved to establishing a consortium in diabetes, and through that developed a couple of guideline projects, including one where we've been doing quite a large network meta-analysis together with many of the members of the MAGIC team, and that's been a great collaboration. And then following that, one of the groups in our consortium has also now developed living guidelines for musculoskeletal conditions. So this was work that was underway over the last few years. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. And what we saw early on was a lot of conflicting, low quality position statements and guidelines being produced around Australia and around the world, which we felt indicated the likelihood of a flood of confusing information for clinicians. And so in March of 2020, we moved very quickly to establish the National COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Task Force to develop national guidelines. And our aim was really to speak with one voice, to bring together really the whole health sector so that we could have one trustworthy COVID-19 clinical guideline to support clinicians during a very difficult time. So I'm just going to very quickly map out how we develop guidelines within the task force. So the work, of course, always starts with a clinical question. So in this example, do corticosteroids work in the treatment of COVID-19? Of course, there are many variants of those questions that might be relevant to other stakeholder groups. One of the advantages of the living guideline model is that you can be in constant communication with your end users. And we encourage clinicians in Australia to submit their questions through our website. And it's those questions that then shape the work of the guideline endeavour led by the task force. So those go first through to our senior clinical group called the Guidelines Leadership Group to assess whether the question is in scope and to prioritise that for work. That then goes through to our evidence team where we develop a structured PICO question and then use that to identify relevant research literature. And we are searching the major global bibliographic databases every night so that we're always aware of emerging new research in COVID. The evidence team then takes that research to develop and maintain living systematic reviews, which then feed into the development of grade evidence profiles. And those grade evidence profiles are then presented to our expert clinical panels. So we have 7 standing panels and also an additional group of experts that we can draw on with very specialized expertise when needed. Supporting those groups, we also have an independent conflicts of interest committee, which has been incredibly important in ensuring very rigorous management of potential competing interests, which is one of the foundations of a trustworthy guideline, and a very strong relationship with the peak consumer body in Australia, the Consumers Health Forum of Australia. And in partnership, we've established a consumer panel which reviews all of our recommendations, but importantly also feeds into the design and governance of the task force itself. So those panels may review the evidence, develop draft recommendations, which then go back to the senior clinical group, which provides an extremely important peer review mechanism, and then decides whether that recommendation should perhaps go back to the panel for further modification, or if not, it'll go forward. And then going forward, we then have an interaction with government through a jurisdictional liaison group for important policy relevant recommendations, asking government if there are important issues regarding implementation that we should take into account before we finalise the recommendation. That then goes through to our steering committee. The steering committee is really there to ensure that correct process has been run. They are not clinical experts. They are representatives of all of our partner organisations, which are now 32 national organisations that constitute the task force partnership. And each week when we update the guidelines, we're asking each of those 32 member organisations to sign off on the recommendations before we then publish. Once we publish, we then use a number of mechanisms to disseminate to clinicians around Australia through traditional media, communique, emails, social media, etc. And then, of course, once a recommendation is live, we then maintain that by continuing to survey for new evidence. And if we identify new evidence, that will be fed through to the relevant panel and the recommendation updated as appropriate. So I just want to mention a few of the learnings we've had through the task force. So first of all, as I mentioned, the task force is a partnership of 32 organisations. And for me, it's really reinforced the fact that the foundation for high quality guideline development is partnerships. And it's these partnerships of key stakeholder groups that has been absolutely critical in ensuring that we've got a very strong unified voice and really the full weight of these peak bodies behind our recommendations, which really provides an incredible sense of confidence and engagement for clinicians. So that work of nurturing and enriching the partnerships with our stakeholders is at least as important as all of the rigorous evidence work that we do. Secondly, our clinicians. So we have over 200 clinicians who, for the first year of the pandemic, were meeting every week to review and update our guideline recommendations. We're, of course, incredibly grateful for all those contributions. But I think the other learning out of this is that clinicians are able to maintain their engagement with a living guideline. Both anecdotally and in some of the qualitative and quantitative work we've done, clinicians have indicated that they highly value currency. They're aware of research. They really do not like contributing to a guideline that then goes out of date. They're very willing to continue to contribute to a guideline in order to maintain it in a up-to-date state. And I think we've noticed that they're very proud of the guideline product that they continue to contribute to and become incredibly strong champions with their clinical colleagues. Thirdly, in terms of communicating more broadly to the general public, we've worked very hard with both in traditional and social media channels to try to become a trusted voice. We've, I think, had some success on that front. This is not to say, of course, that all the coverage has been positive. At the time of great controversy around drugs like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, there's been quite a lot of criticism of the task force. I think the point I would make here, I think, is that we need, I think, as a guideline community and as clinicians and researchers, to recognize that we live in a world now where we're algorithmically fragmented. And I think we need to do more to engage with those communities who are disengaged from public institutions, who have a mistrust of the system, and really work much harder on specific initiatives to engage with those communities. In terms of clinician engagement, we continue to monitor activity and uptake and use through the website and through the Magic platform, and really had very, very strong usage data throughout. But also in some of the research that we've done, we've been asking clinicians, what are the most important attributes of the guidelines that we've been developing? And you can see here the most important element here is the importance of updating. Currency is important. The other point I would make is that people have often wondered whether a guideline that has been updating frequently would confuse clinicians, with very frequent changes. But again, what we've found through this research and anecdotally is that, again, clinicians using the guideline deeply value its currency. They value that it's up to date, and they expect it to change over time. They know that is how research works. There is always new research being produced, and they want to see that incorporated into the guideline. We've also, I think, learned a lot working with government, and have developed quite a close working relationship, but at the same time, of course, always emphasizing the independence of the guidelines that we produce. More recently, we've now been working very closely with our regulatory agency and a health technology assessment, such that we're able to access individual documents from sponsors, what are called clinical study reports, and that's been extremely helpful. But just to note that there are, of course, always challenges in managing the relationships with government. But I think government has also very much valued the living model, so that we are responsive to the, to the important matters which are impacting on policymakers as they occur, so that they have a partner who can be responding in real time to those particular challenges. I'll just mention very briefly that in terms of tracking what impact our recommendations are having on actual practice and patient outcomes, in Australia, unfortunately, we have quite a fragmented health data landscape. And so we've only had patchy success in being able to measure concordance between our recommendations and practice. This is one example, looking at high flow nasal cannula use in Australian ICUs. And it's really, the intensive care community has had extremely strong data systems, and that's really been a great opportunity for us to track practice. The other example has been in primary care. We've been able to look at drug dispensing data, but it's been, relatively coarse data. So here, looking overall at, for example, underuse of corticosteroids in primary care because of reduced presentations for other conditions. You can see here early on an increased use of ivermectin. So some data from primary care. So just to summarize, I think we have, through the last few years, being able to demonstrate, at least in these initial projects, that it is possible to develop guidelines that are both trustworthy and up to date. And then this graphic gives you some example. So this is looking at remdesivir for the treatment of COVID-19. The green are the publications of randomized controlled trial data, and the blue are systematic reviews. So first of all, you can see that the number of conventional systematic reviews now, as in many other topics, is outnumbering the number of randomized controlled trials. This is then looking at the duration for which those systematic reviews remained accurate. And half of the systematic reviews were out of date the day they were published, and the other half had a median time to becoming out of date of 17 days. So this was completely inadequate mechanism for keeping up to date with the research as it emerged. With our guideline effort, we were able to keep up to date, and the time from publication of new data to the updating of the guideline was about 14 days over this period. And this, of course, is in part because we were publishing through a website, not through a traditional journal, where there's, of course, many more steps in the publication process. So in closing, I just would like to thank partners and funders, but of course, all of the individuals who've contributed to the task force and all the other Living Guideline projects over the last few years. Most importantly, all of the clinicians and consumer who've continued to contribute to all the different panels. Thank you very much for your time.